Добра вечер, почитувани гледачи. Јас сум Драган Милосављевиќ, а вие следите емисијата Заспиј, ако можеш. Вечерва имам наистина ретка, да не речам уникатна можност да разговарам со човек кој што не може често да се сретне на јавната сцена, особено во Македонија. Се работи за универзитетски професор од Норвешка, кој во својата земја на некој начин има улога на дисидент, ако така смеам да кажам, со оглед на фактот дека неговото научно и приватно мислење често пати не се совпаѓа со наративот кој што е вообичаен во Западна Европа и воопшто во Европската унија, САД и земите кои што се во коалиција со нив. Ке ве замолам ова интервју, како сите што ги правам со овакви гости, да го погледнете со максимално отворен ум, да размислите околу тоа што го зборува господинот Глен Ерик Андре Дизен, или како што тој самиот вели, Глен Дизен, Ерик и Андре се само додатни имиња. Значи да размислувате со отворен ум и да донесете заклучоци, се разбира, самите. Меѓутоа, јас како човек кој што верува во слободата на говорот, сакам да разговарам и со луѓе кои што имаат навистина специфични разбирања за односите на меѓународната, да речеме, сцена, и луѓе кои што често пати одаат спроти брановите. So, Professor Glen Eric Dizен, thank you for accepting my invitation for this interview.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. Your first time in Macedonia, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So did you enjoy the staying here?
Yeah, very much so. I've only been here for 2 days, but yeah, I've been planning to come for almost 25 years. So it's about time.
About time,
Yeah.
Exactly. So you are not, you don't know much about the situation on the Balkan Peninsula, let's say, and in Macedonia. But on the other hand, you are very good in the knowledge for what's happening in Europe and worldwide. Now, in your country, in Norway, you're some kind of dissident. Maybe that is too strong word, but some kind of dissident because you don't really agree with the official opinion of you about what's happening, let's say, in the war in Ukraine or the state of the human rights, let's say, in the Europe. How is that possible to be dissident in the country like Norway?
Well, yeah, dissident, yeah, it could be maybe a strong word. I think the problem is you can't really do basic analysis anymore because my main focus is Russian security policy and political economy. So if you want to study the security strategy of Russia or any country, first you have to define what is threatening the country and how do they respond. This is any country. But when we talk about Russia, we're not allowed to discuss what threatens Russia because the main threat to Russia is NATO, but we're not allowed to say that NATO threatens Russia. If you do that, then you're taking Russia's side. But this is the problem, because if you can't recognize what threatens Russia's security, you can't explain its policies. So every time Russia does anything, we say it happens in a vacuum, out of nowhere. They don't react to anything. So, if there's a conflict, it's because they wake up one day, they want to have territory, they're just very aggressive, they want to restore the Soviet Union. Everything happens for no reason at all. And this makes it impossible to explain what Russia and other countries do, even if you want to say the same about China, for example. So for this reason, we end up, in my opinion, to do very stupid things because we keep pursuing policies which will have very predictable bad consequences for us. So, there's a lack of ability to criticize our own policies. But if you can't criticize your own policies, you can't improve your own security. So it's a very difficult position to be in Europe.
But isn't the possibility to criticize one of the real thing in the freedom of speech? So what's the problem? Academics should have chance for another opinion.
Yeah, they should have, but this is not the case, and I think it's specifically in times of crisis, because it's a very deep instinct in human beings. That is, when you feel threats, you demand solidarity in the in-group. So everyone has to show that they support us and not the other side. So everything becomes a struggle between good versus evil. Now,
and evil is the other side, of course.
Yeah, it's always the other side. Because we're good, we don't do anything wrong. And this is important to have solidarity by saying we're good, they're evil. Now, and I understand this, but the problem is if you want to have security, you have to be able to recognize the security concern of the other side, because the whole international system is defined by security competition. So if you don't recognize how you undermine the security of the other side, how can you then improve mutual security? It's impossible. So we've locked ourselves in this very dangerous position because we say everything is good versus evil, we can't be criticized, and this is the source of all our, let's say stupid policies, which are quite foolish at the moment.
Yeah. You're a professor of University of Southeastern Norway, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if somebody read about you on Wikipedia, let's say, they will say that after that you are graduated in, I don't know, in Australia and all your degrees and everything about your academic career, you will see that they say he's regular commentator of the Russian state-controlled international news, and academic as well as Scandinavian media have criticized him for promoting Russian propaganda. So there is some kind of sign on your head that you are promoting the propaganda of the other state, specifically Russia, which is now, if we are correct, enemy of the entire Europe.
Yeah, well...
Are you a Russian spy?
No, I am not a Russian spy, but but I used to study, well, I research, again, Russian politics, and for a while I was working as a professor in Russia as well. So for me it was quite natural to speak and to discuss with Russian media as well, given that I worked there and this is my job. But then when I came back to Norway, I was told that this is Russian propaganda. If you talk to Russian media, that means you're supporting propaganda. And it is quite extraordinary, because I've sometimes written my own articles, published on my own Substack, and then it's okay. And then the Russians, they ask, can we publish it on our channel? I say, of course, it's okay. And then it's propaganda. So I don't think people know what propaganda actually is. It just means that you're talking to the other side. But this is very important. If you want to have peace, you need to have some mutual understanding, understanding the security concern of the other side. Mm-hmm. And often when they say propaganda, one of my arguments, for example, is that by expanding NATO, we threaten Russian security. This was uncontroversial in the early 90s. You had, Bill Clinton himself warned, if we expand NATO, we can redivide Europe. His Secretary of Defense also said this is a betrayal of Russia, and he said he was considering to quit. He said everyone in the administration in America knew that this would be seen as a threat to Russia and a betrayal, and would cancel the peace. This is why people like George Kennan said, this will start a new Cold War. So this was widely understood, but we decided to do it because, as the Secretary of Defense William Perry said, they were weak, so we could do whatever we wanted. But we knew this would cause conflict, and after we decide to expand NATO, we say everyone agrees, okay, now we agree this is the new reality, and we don't criticize it. And then 20 years later, we have conflict, and now everyone's pretending as if expanding NATO, that this is a threat to Russia, is only propaganda. So I say, well, here's all the evidence. I have a mountain of evidence. But they say, yes, but you're repeating what the Kremlin is saying. Because we are saying this, Kremlin is saying that. So now you're taking their side. But
are you?
No, I take the side of objective reality and pursuit of facts. And this is my point as well. Facts are important, because if you ignore it, then you end up in a very difficult situation, which is what we're doing now. We're expanding towards the Russian border. We say we can put missiles on Russian borders, and it's not a threat to Russia. And when Russia then respond, we say it's unprovoked. They're just aggressive. They want to have the Soviet Union back, and so we're not able to pursue good policies to improve our own security.
I understand completely, Professor. But if we are real, Russia is the side who started the war. They attack Ukraine, right?
Yes,
2.5 years ago, they attacked Ukraine. That's the fact. Okay, we know the background of the story, of course. And the revolution in Ukraine in 2014, and then Crimea story and Donetsk revolution, rebellion, whatever you will call. But fact is that Russia started the war with their neighboring country in the 21st century, which was widely believed that it will never happen in Europe anymore.
No, that's correct. They did invade Ukraine, which is led to a huge disaster. Now, I'm not saying that that's legitimate. I'm not saying it's that it's consistent with international law, but I'm just saying that it was very predictable, because imagine the other scenario around. If Russia or China would establish military bases in Mexico, put its missiles in Mexico.
That is almost impossible.
Yeah, well, America would bomb that country to the ground. They would never permit it. It's not legal, it's not legitimate, but they would still do it. This is the reality. So recognizing reality is important, not to legitimize something that's being done, but in order to recognize why this is important. And like now we could call this Russian propaganda, but keep in mind the current director of the CIA, William Burns, he wrote in 2008, he warned us, do not try to get Ukraine into NATO, because it will start a civil war, as it did in 2014, and then Russia will likely invade. And he made the point, Russia does not want to invade, but it will, because they cannot accept NATO in Ukraine. Even the British ambassador to Russia said in 2020, in December, that this is a very foolish policy. What are we doing? We're trying to expand into Ukraine when most Ukrainians did not want NATO, and we know this is going to create war. I even said, if you want to start war with Russia, this is the best way to do it. Mm-hmm. Even Angela Merkel said, this is Russia will consider it a declaration of war. So we know this, but we still do it. And this is why it's a very foolish policy. It doesn't mean that I support that Russia's invading. I'm just saying it's very predictable. If we take this action and move into Ukraine, Russia will respond with military force, and we did it anyways.
Yeah, but Professor, you said we did it anyway.
Yeah.
Who are we, in fact? All the Europe and United States together. For example, you're from Norway. Norway is not part of the conflict. Norway is not part of the European Union. It's part of the NATO, right? But there is no way for war between, let's say, Norway and Russia. But probably in Norway they believe that they are in conflict with Russia or not. When you say we did it,
yeah.
It's like we are all in that part. Macedonia, for example, is part of NATO, so we are also in this conflict in some way.
Yeah. No, I agree, and it's becoming increasingly more of a direct war between NATO and Russia. This is what is so dangerous, and this is why the denials are so dangerous as well, because we can't criticize ourselves. We have to ignore what we said last year. So, for example, when the war after Russia invaded, what did people like Joe Biden said? We cannot send F-16s because that's World War III. That's very dangerous. Now we are sending F-16s, and if I say this is very provocative, it's going to escalate the war, and then they say, "Oh, now you're repeating what Russia's saying. That's propaganda." Mm-hmm. No, this is what Joe Biden said 2 years ago. But
now it's forgotten.
Yeah, now it's forgotten, and now they're saying, "Listen, we might send missiles. The British and the Americans will send missiles to be launched deep into Russia, but these missiles will be operated by Americans. They will be guided by American satellites, and probably they will, much more will operate by Americans. The only thing is they will launch them from Ukraine, and now the Russians are saying, well, this is a direct war. NATO directly attacking us. We will respond. And we're saying, oh, this is propaganda. Well, and if you repeat it, then you're repeating what Kremlin is saying, which means you're taking their side instead of our side. Mm-hmm. My whole point is this is very childish, because our main objective should be to increase our own security. If we attack Russia, or they perceive us as attacking Russia, they will respond. So we're ignoring reality, and this is why it's so very, very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. So let's back a little bit on you yourself. For example, Swedish journalist Patrick Oksanen, I think. Oksanen says that you are an important role in the RT at the Western expand, which gives legitimacy to what clearly appears to be the Kremlin version, okay, of the things. And now his writings are unreliable. The factual basis is doubtful and characterized by the content and from a Russian propaganda. So there is opinion in the Western world, let's say, that exactly your writing are unreliable.
Well, it depends who you mean, who talks for the Western world. I get a lot.
Of course, that's the question.
I do speak with a lot of academics, and they
do you have support from somebody there?
No, a lot of academics are quite supportive. They're saying, we agree. You can't talk about this war unless you talk about NATO expansion. But everyone knows if you talk about NATO expansion, the media will crucify you. They will destroy you. They will call you names, and you might lose your job. So people stay very quiet. But I'm familiar with that interview because almost 90% of all negative articles about me come from one place. It's a non-governmental organization which is financed by government, and you might be familiar with them in this part of the world. One of them is National Endowment for Democracy. It was established in the 1980s by the Reagan administration for the explicit purpose of manipulating civil society in other countries. So they're financed by government. They are staffed by people close to intelligence community. It's proven that their main goal was to take over some responsibility from CIA. There's written many books, articles. They have people from CIA who's been whistleblower writing, and these are the NGOs which are financing Norwegian NGOs, and these Norwegian NGOs are the one of them who keeps writing articles about me all the time, actually, and they keep calling the university. When I go to speak at events, I'm invited. They try to shame them, ask you cannot invite him. He works for Russia, and and this is the kind of cancellation. They're very extreme, actually, because I got problems to extent people called and threatened me. So I talked to police. They said, "Oh, take your address off the internet and phone number," and I did. And then this NGO, a human rights organization financed by Washington, it put my address on the internet, on their social media. So this is not normal.
Purposely, I guess.
Yeah, of course. Why would you put my address on the internet?
So how do you feel that you're like in danger?
I think I'm okay, but it's very. It has nothing to do with human rights. It's nothing to do with democracy. It's just intimidations.
But you're not afraid, let's say, that will find a way to cut you from your job in the university?
Oh yeah, no, I think they will probably one day.
And then what?
I think I'll go back to Australia I probably leave Norway because it's a very hostile environment for academics. So
you say Norway is a very hostile environment for academics.
Well,
it's very strange. In our point of view, Norway is some kind of perfect state, not just about when you talk about the standard of living, but also about the freedom of speech, about democracy, security, and everything. So what you say now here is some kind of shocking.
No, a lot of things are pretty good in Norway. A lot of things work. In many areas you have, good freedom of speech. And even my university, they're very strong on academic freedom because they keep getting the same calls from the NGOs saying, why is he allowed to work here? Should get rid of him. But they say, no, we have academic freedom. So we have good principles. We have good traditions of protecting this. But it's a very ugly atmosphere at the moment. In every media report, everything is, a battle between good and evil.
Black and white.
Everything is black and white. And if you're seen as trying to explain the other side, they say, you're a traitor. Don't you care about the Ukrainians? They're dying. Why don't you want to help Ukraine? Are you anti-Ukrainian? And my answer is always the same. For more than 10 years, I said, this is very dangerous. We should not do this. If NATO moves into Ukraine, tries to do it, Russia will attack. They will destroy Ukraine. This is horrible. If you care about Ukraine, listen to what the CIA said. Listen to what all these American, British, and German ambassadors said. They warned that war would happen. So why are we doing this? And even when the Russians first invaded, we don't tell the truth anymore because on the first day of the invasion, Zelensky confirmed Moscow contacted them to try to start peace negotiations. On the third day after invasion, they agreed to start talking. And even Zelensky himself argued in an interview with The Economist that the Americans, well, they said some Western countries wanted no peace. They said it's better to have a long war. And he recognized even if it destroys Ukraine, Zelensky said, they want a long war so they can exhaust Russia. How is this pro-Ukrainian? I think we're using the Ukrainians to bleed the Russians. But they use these terms. They say pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian. It doesn't mean anything. They have to define these concepts.
So you think that Ukraine is in fact a victim from Russia from one side, and on the other side from the political ambitions, let's say, or geopolitical ambition of the Western world?
I think they're a geopolitical pawn at this moment. They're being destroyed by NATO and Russia. Russia's not innocent in this. I'm not trying to paint them as angels. But what was interesting is, what can't be denied is that the Russians for 7 years tried to implement the Minsk agreement, while the Germans and the French, they admit they sabotaged it, and then they invaded very explicitly for the purpose of forcing a peace on the Ukrainians. And as you know from the mediators, the Turkish and Israeli, the Americans and British, they convinced Zelensky not to take the peace agreement. And the peace agreement was based on neutrality, so no NATO, and instead to go for war. Now for the Russians, what did this mean? It meant suddenly they're in Ukraine, and it becomes a war of attrition. If they leave Ukraine, NATO will come in. So now they have to destroy a Ukrainian army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. It's the country is being destroyed. This is just from a humanitarian perspective, this is grotesque, it's horrific. And yet, we want for 2.5 years, the EU always says we have to sit down and talk when there's conflicts all around the world. This is the one thing they always say. This time, 2.5 years, they don't want to even sit down and talk with Russia, while, you know, tens of thousands of people are dying, young men.
Yeah, but President Zelensky in the last couple of months says that he has some kind of plan for victory or for peace. I'm not sure about the right pronounce of the thing, because in one media they say it's a plan for victory, in other media say it's a plan for peace. And he says mostly that if the let's say free world unite about around his political idea that Russia must be struggle in financial way, in economic way, and if Russia must give too much victims in the war, then they will be, Moscow or Mr. Putin, President Putin will be in a situation that must take peace offer. Peace offer that is, let's say, fair for the Ukrainian side.
Yeah, see, this is why I think it's important to first analyze the security concern of the Russians, because if Russia faces no threats, one day it just wants to take new territories because it wants to have a Soviet Union back, then I would agree with Mr. Zelensky. Then, you know, send weapons, because then the cost for Russia goes up, and the cost-benefit analysis means Russia would think, okay, maybe not more territory, let's go home. So, but this is not what I see as reality. I think reality is...
So you think it's not about the territory?
No, I think the territory is a symptom now. Now it's territory because in the process they annexed a lot of land. And here's my point. If the war is because Russia fears for its existence, for its security, then the more weapons we send, the more Russia will escalate. And we never define what victory is. What is this victory? If we exhaust Russia, they weaken, they don't have more soldiers, and then we begin to push, we're going to take back Crimea. If we recognize Russia sees this as an existential threat, we don't have to agree, but if we recognize Russia does, and it will act upon this, that means under no circumstance will we be able to have a victory. And this is why I think we're going to see nuclear weapons dropped all across Europe before NATO gets to march through Crimea.
So you believe that if Russia is losing the war, let's say finally losing the war, then Putin will start to nuke European cities?
Yeah, I think that's very clear. But regarding the territory, you know, this is what's quite interesting, because on the Minsk agreement, the agreement was to reintegrate Donbass back into Crimea. When, in the beginning of 2022, when they had the Istanbul peace agreement between the Ukrainians and the Russians, they hadn't signed it, but what they had negotiated, the main agreement was Russia will pull back to where it was before the invasion, and Ukraine will have to accept neutrality, so no NATO. Everyone recognizes, the Ukrainian side recognizes it, his advisor, the head of his political party, the ambassador who negotiated for Ukraine, the Russians say it, the mediators, the Turkish, the Israeli, everyone recognized this. So it wasn't about territory first. But once the war began, and they began to drive the Ukrainians back, when they move into new territories, how can you have civil administration, have cooperation from the local population? If you say, oh, when the war is finished, we're going to leave, and you might all be executed. No, of course not. So they give guarantees, which is now you're part of the Russian Federation, and we will never leave this land. So that was, I guess, a means to an end. But also for NATO, they say once the war is over, Ukraine will be part of NATO. But we don't think. What does this tell the Russians?
But that position is still on the table.
Yeah.
They say officially that Ukraine will become member of NATO one day.
Yeah, but if you are Russia, you see Ukraine, NATO and Ukraine as a threat to your existence, and NATO says after the war, Ukraine will be part of NATO. What will you do? What message are you sending? You're telling the Ukrainians, oh, no, you're telling the Russians, you have to take all the territories which are strategic, so the Black Sea coast and Kharkov, and everything else that remains, just wreck it, destroy it, make it a basket case, something that is ungovernable. And because once you're finished, the rest will be taken by NATO. So I'm not saying this is good, I'm not saying it's legitimate, but I'm saying this is the incentives we're sending. It's very dangerous. So
yeah, but Ukraine is, sorry to interrupt, Professor, but Ukraine is an independent state. In fact, if they want to go in NATO, well, they can go. That's the point of independence. You know, if you say you can't go in NATO because you are our neighbor, and because we believe that that is the threat for us, it's like you are not independent country. You are depending from us. You know, Ukrainian government says we want to be a part of NATO. Yeah. Macedonia says we want to be a part of NATO. And let's say now, I don't know, Serbia or Albania attack us because we want to be a part of NATO.
No, I'm not saying it's fair and as good. And this is also why it's a good argument to convince the public, because you're saying Ukraine should be allowed to join NATO. It's a sovereign right. You know, who disagrees? Of course, Ukraine is a sovereign country. And also, by extension, it's not fair that Russia should be allowed to determine Ukraine's foreign policy. But it's also true what I said before, that is, you know, Mexico doesn't have the freedom to join a Chinese military alliance. We can argue it's a free country, they should have this right, but the reality is they don't. America would destroy them before they would ever permit this to happen. So it's
not about fair or something like that. It's about the strength of the country.
Yeah, so that's a question. What is morality? Is morality to say this is right, irrespective of reality? Is that moral, or is morality to recognize reality to prevent a disaster? Because
that's a good question.
Yeah, because we're arguing the moral thing now is to stand for Ukraine's rights, even if it destroys Ukraine. I argue no. We have to accept reality. This is the moral thing to do. Otherwise, we ignore the consequences of what will happen.
Yeah, but somebody will say that, let's say, if we accept the reality in World War II, when Germany invites many countries, let's say Norway, right?
Oh, yeah.
So it was like for United States or for Russia in that time to say, well, that's the reality. Germany will destroy Norway if we do something, and let's give them Norway, right?
No, I agree. It's not always black and white, and there is some nuance. So this is why, you know, I can also understand, especially for many countries, if you're in the Baltic states or Poland, you know, I can understand historically why you'd want to be part of a military alliance.
They are afraid of Russia.
Of course. If I was in Poland, I want to be part of NATO. But I would also have to know, if I was in Ukraine, I can understand, especially now, I would want to be a part of NATO for protection. But I would also understand, if you try to invite the Americans on the borders of a great power, that other great power will probably destroy you. Yeah. But there's also the premise of the whole thing, because this whole narrative, it suggests NATO is simply a third party. It just wants to help Ukraine. But the reality is, between 1991 and 2014, only about 20% of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. it was the Americans who were really pulling hard. They wanted to bring Ukraine into the orbit of NATO away from Russia, even though every single poll showed the Ukrainians favored not to have to go. They didn't want to go to NATO. 80% did not support this. And nonetheless, the Americans kept pushing and pushing and trying to pull them in. And so this idea that we're only trying to help the Ukrainians, that America is like Amnesty International with nuclear weapons, I think it's absurd. No, but they have their own interests. They're pursuing power politics, and they're selling it to the public as simply altruism, wanting to help the poor Ukrainians.
Well, that is naive, of course.
Yeah.
But Professor, are you afraid? In these days, we have two big wars, one in the Middle East and one in Ukraine. Are you afraid that it's possible to escalate even more? You know, people say, mostly in the media, you can read that kind of articles and from some serious politicians, that if Russia, for example, win the war in Ukraine, they will attack, I don't know, Baltic states or Poland. It was question like, who is the next? I don't believe in that.
No, and I think it's political propaganda, and it's because first we say Ukraine has to be part of NATO, because Russia would never dare to attack NATO. Now we're saying, oh, once Russia finishes Ukraine, they will attack NATO. So you can't have it both ways.
Yeah, that's strange, of course.
That does make sense. So
you have Article 5, right?
Yeah. No, but yeah, but why are we saying, but these two arguments, that Ukraine has to be a part of NATO because Russia's afraid it won't attack NATO, but now we're saying once Russia's finished with Ukraine, then it will attack NATO. But these are two contradictory arguments. So I haven't seen any evidence for it. If anything, I've seen Russia being very restrained because it's very careful. It doesn't want a war with NATO. Anyways, what would it be for? To take Poland, the 40 million people who not one Polish want to be a part of Russian Federation? No, this is not going to work.
Yeah, but on the Baltic states, you have a lot of Russian minority.
Yeah. No, but
that is a different thing.
Yeah, and of course, if they are discriminated, who knows what can happen? I'm just saying I haven't seen any evidence anyone in Russia ever talked about this. And indeed, even with Crimea, no one in Russia talked about taking back even Crimea before 2014. But when the government was toppled and they knew NATO was coming, what did they do? They want to protect their Black Sea fleet, so they take Crimea. But before then, no one had laid claim to it. No one was pushing for it. So I don't see the evidence. I think it's a nice story to say that, you know, we are good, they are bad, and this is unprovoked. But no, I think it's just wrong. And it's a self-delusion, which is harming us ourselves as well. Because
self-delusion, you say?
Very much so, because we could have made a reasonable peace with Russia. And instead, you know, imagine before 2014, if we hadn't toppled the government in Ukraine, they would have all their territory, including Crimea. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians would still be alive. The country wouldn't be destroyed. This was not a good policy. If we would have been honest that this was seen as a threat to Russia, we could have avoided this. And but no, your question, sorry. I do worry about the possibility of nuclear war, because the thing is, Russia is much more powerful than Ukraine. So over time, Russia is destroying the Ukrainian army, and NATO has a dilemma. So
are you sure that one day Russia will destroy the army of Ukraine?
No, I think the war is already pretty much over. It's they have a huge manpower problem. They don't have air defenses.
Yeah, but still the contact line is not very far away from the beginning of the war.
Yeah, but it depends how you measure progress in a war of attrition, because in a war of attrition, you're destroying the enemy, the army of the enemy. So when the enemy army is strong, it's very costly to take territory, because you use a lot of men and equipment. You lose a lot when they're well fortified. What you do is you bleed the enemy dry.
Constantly, yeah.
Yeah, and when they're weak, then you begin to take the territory. And that's the stage we have reached now, that Russia's starting to take one strategic town after the other. So I think the war's coming to an end. And this is my concern, because what does NATO do? It can either negotiate with Russia or escalate. And every time NATO escalates, it sends more heavier weapons to strike inside Russia. And now we don't really have that much weapon anymore. And the only next thing to escalate is to have these American-British missiles, which are fired by Americans and British, and this is a
like
direct
store
war.
shutdowns or
Yeah.
attacks, yeah.
And this is the problem. So now I think either NATO will end up in direct war with Russia, or we're going to have to accept we lost the war. And
But everybody say that losing the war is not acceptable.
yeah, no.
So
But
that's the big question.
And there-
If nobody can accept we lose the war, Russia will never accept, NATO will, let's say, never accept, then what? Then we have confrontation which will happen in some real level now.
yeah, and it could very quickly escalate into nuclear war.
Exactly.
So we're saying we can't negotiate with Russia, but they're also saying we should not be afraid of nuclear weapons, because Russia, if he threatens us with nuclear weapons, we say it's blackmail. But this is a very absurd way of looking at it. You should have a healthy concern about nuclear weapons, because if you know if we enter this war with Russia and we're winning, they will use nuclear weapons, and we can't afford to lose. So this can't have any good outcome. But it seems as if the Americans are beginning to walk this back a bit. I think they very clearly communicating now. For example, with Zelensky's victory plan, that was pretty much, America joins in on the war,
Yeah.
and they become part of NATO. This is not going to happen. The Americans told them very clearly, this is we can't do this. So this seems to be, the Europeans, I think, have lost their minds. They don't seem to be afraid of nuclear war, but the Americans are telling the Europeans to walk it back. And I think this is maybe a good time to be a vassal of America, because the Americans, they do seem to be a little bit more sensible than the Europeans at this moment.
Let's talk about a little bit about the Scandinavian states. In the last century, in fact, most of Scandinavian states were pretty much peaceful, right? Especially Sweden and Finland. Now Sweden and Finland became part of members of NATO. Is it real understanding of that? Why? Because Finland and Sweden were good enough without NATO.
Yeah.
But now they become parts because they say, the government of Finland and Sweden says we are in danger from Russia and we must be part of NATO to defend ourselves.
But we're in danger of Russia during the Cold War. From the Soviet Union was much more powerful. It had a very different ideology. It had more, I think, expansionist impulse.
And Sweden and Finland survived very well.
Yeah, they did. But the reason is, and this is my whole point, if you want security, the point of departure has to be security competition. That is, all countries are competing for security. So for Norway, we were part of NATO, but we had a very strict policy. We said no foreign bases and no Americans in the north, because we have bordered with the Russians.
With Russia, yeah.
So we put these limitations on ourselves. It was not to be nice to the Russians. We recognize we want to be NATO, so we deter the Russians, but we don't want to put troops on the Russian borders because this will be provocative. So you want to have deterrence, but without provoking a response. So this was our strategy. And this made sense, and it was the same with Finland. They became you had a belt of neutral state from north to south, with Scandinavia being quite important. Finland was the greatest success story of neutrality. Yeah. Now they're the biggest front line of NATO against Russia. This is no one explained to me why this is a good idea. Mr. Stoltenberg says, well, Putin wanted less NATO, now he has more.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
But this is not security. This is spite. So we're going to put a lot of NATO right on your border. We win. How do we win? Now Russia, this is provoking. Now Russia will have to build up a big northern district pointing at Finland, and Finland will have diminished security. We have to measure in security. Now the logic is the more weapons pointing at Russia, the more security. But this is not security. You have to accept there's a security competition, and if you provoke the adversaries, they will respond in a very negative way. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we're having very serious discussions about this.
Yeah, but when we are talking about atrocities, in fact, NATO member states are much bigger than Russia in population, let's say. Yeah. Also, they are much richer than Russia. So maybe the point is that in the long term, Russia can't afford to escalate with NATO, because simply it can be in the position to do that.
Well, that's my I think another flaw, and this has been one of my research areas since 2014, is Russia organizing its economy to the east. Because for the past 300 years, since Peter the Great, Russia's goal was...
West, of course.
If you want to modernize, you become more Western. So they look to the West for economic partnerships and modernization. And even the past, since Gorbachev's days, but also up to 2014, Russia pursued what they called Greater Europe. They wanted to integrate with Europe. But after we toppled their government in Ukraine and said, we're going to make this a front line, not a bridge, this is when the Russians began to shift huge in 2014. They began to cut economic ties with the West and reorient it to the East. So they said the main partners have to be, China, India, a lot of these giants in the East. And so we're talking the technological partnerships, the industrial partnerships, the natural resources. So the grain going east with grain corridors, gas, oil. We're seeing new transportation corridors from, Russia, Iran to India, Russia, China. We're seeing new development banks. They're using their own currencies, new payment systems. So they're reorienting to the east. And the question is, has this been successful? And according to World Bank, Russia's now the fourth largest economy in purchasing power parity. It's growing, even in the middle of a war. Meanwhile, so Russia could diversify. It's going east. And Europe, we cannot. This is why we can't, German energy-intensive industry can't do without Russia. So now our economies are going down. And this is a little bit like the US and China. China, when the Americans put economic sanctions, China can diversify. It can be self-sufficient or cooperate with other countries. America cannot. They're losing a lot of industry, and their tech industry is suffering. So
yeah, but let's think about on the different, let's say, way. Russia is in some strategic point of view friend with China, with India in BRICS, right?
Yeah.
With Brazil, etc., but they are not really geostrategic partners. Not like the Western state, which is unified, in fact. I mean, China has their own interests, let's say, who are not always the same with the interest of Russia, for example. Or, I don't know, China and India. They have their own problems between those states. It's not like in the West where it seems like everything is quite unified.
No, they have many competing interests, and that's some of the work they're trying to do in BRICS. They're saying, how can we harmonize our interests? So, for example, 10 years ago, it was very common to predict that Russia and China would have conflict over Central Asia. Who gets to dominate it?
Yeah.
But it didn't happen because the Russians and Chinese, they try, how can we harmonize our economic activity in this region? And the Russians have the Eurasian Economic Union, the Chinese have the Belt and Road, and then they try to harmonize it under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And so they're trying to find solutions, but no, they're not all unified. I mean, China and India, they're not best of friends.
Exactly.
But this is part of the BRICS as well. When they're expanding, they have Iran and they have United Arab Emirates. They have Egypt and they have Ethiopia. These countries have conflicts, but they're trying to use economics to improve the political disputes. So there are attempts to improve this, but again, when I make the argument that the Russians are doing well, they're growing, they can have their security, I'm saying their economy is going east, their weapons are pointing to the west because we're the one threatening them. It's not to say, yes, as I keep telling Norwegian journalists, it's not because I'm trying to take Russia's side. I'm saying our main problem is we kept telling ourselves for 30 years now, Russia's a gas station masquerading as a country. But we deluded ourselves. We thought we can defeat them on the battlefield. We cannot. We thought we can destroy them with sanctions in a week. We can't. We thought we can tell the whole world to isolate Russia. They won't. No one outside NATO wants to join this really, besides Japan and Korea. So we are fooling ourselves, and this is why it's so dangerous, because we're not pursuing smart policies.
What kind of fooling is that? Fooling based on arrogance of the great one?
Yeah, hubris, I think. And this is also why, for me, who has been studying this, it was quite predictable that the Russians were able to reduce dependence on the West and look east. And yet, a big reason why the Europeans joined in on these strong sanctions against Russia was they pretty much believed that the Russian economy could only survive till the end of the weekend. That was it. Without us, because we're so economically mighty. And it turns out this is all false. The world is not the 90s anymore. America is not all powerful. There's new centers of power around the world, which Russia is going to. And this is also why it's a very poor policy, because strategically, you don't want to push Russia too far away, because now they're ending up a bit too close with China, for example. You would like to have Russia being able to diversify a bit more, so it doesn't become too reliant. Instead, now you're seeing what was Kissinger's worst nightmare. You have China, Russia, India, Brazil, all these countries working together to learn how to live without America, to create a new economic system, new security cooperation. This is not in our interest, and this is why I'm saying it's important to be honest. What is the security concerns of Russia? What is it afraid of? And what capabilities does it have to respond to this? We keep lying to ourselves, and we end up with these very stupid policies.
Many experts say that the real threat for United States dominance, in fact, is China, and that United States, if they want to be in the next period dominant in the world, they must deal with China in some way. So you think that that time is already lost, that there is no chance for that?
I think I'm very for that. I'm very supportive of strong industrial policies. And America has some huge problems. I think they should increase their competitiveness against China. They can have a very forceful industrial policy, help its tech sector become more competitive. The problem of the United States is that they insist on rebuilding global hegemony. And this is not enough to strengthen its core economic. Instead, they also have to sabotage China. So they're saying very openly, let's destroy the Chinese economy. Let's roll back its technological development.
Yeah, but that is the way to open conflict, I think.
Yeah, but it's not going to work. They could have worked in the 90s and 2000s, but it's too late. And we see
so
this.
It's too late for you.
Yeah, look with the chip ban. The Americans put sanctions on sending these chips to China, and they say now they can't live without us. The tech sector will fall. Within a few months, the Chinese comes with their own chips, and they say, we can build them ourselves. We don't need America. Meanwhile, the Americans, Intel, they lost 15,000 jobs. The tech sector in America is struggling because their main consumer was China. So China can live without America. America, it can't
live with China. Interesting.
No, the supply chains, we built the supply chains over decades, and now they're being torn apart. And because the Chinese worked from the bottom, doing everything up and doing higher and higher in the global supply chains or value chains, and now we see that they have more ability to have self-sufficiency, while the Americans are struggling. So the Americans end up hurting themselves. If they would have been honest about how dependent they were on China and the vitality of the Chinese industry, they could have a different strategy. Like I said, they could have built up their own tech sector, subsidized it, without starting a trade war with the Chinese. I mean, this is it was a strategy based on the wrong data and also the wrong objective. Because if America can learn to live with China as an equal, they wouldn't have to go to economic war. But again, America insists on hegemony. This is also why we have war with Russia, by the way. So
yeah, let's back in Europe again. What do you think about the future of the European Union? I mean, Norway is not part of the European Union. Macedonia, for example, is struggling for becoming part of the Union about more than 25 years. It's not still happening, but nevertheless, do you think that Europe has chance for bigger unification, to become some kind of super state, or something else will happen?
No. I tend to be, unfortunately, a bit pessimistic. And the reason is, I think it's good to see the EU as a sovereignty maximizing entity. That is, why do states want to be part of NATO? No, sorry, the EU. Well, EU. Because they can strengthen them economically, and also you have collective bargaining power. So you become more powerful, but they also have to give up some sovereignty. Now, in the 90s and 2000s, the EU was performing very well. And there was a good argument that people wanted to join for this collective bargaining power. These days, the EU can't really deliver that much anymore. The industrial policy is not great. They're not. They're weakening themselves.
Yeah, but again, open borders. You can work wherever you want. Things like that.
Yeah, this is positive. But
level of democracy.
Yeah, well, if you see the EU as having two columns, one plus and one minus, every day I see the plus beginning to weaken. You mentioned Schengen, yeah, but now they're going to put up more border controls.
Yeah, like Germany did already.
Yeah, like Germany did, and you're going to have a lot of the benefits goes away. Before we had the single market, but this was more from the former industrial revolution. We don't have the new. We're not prepared for the fourth industrial revolution. We don't have our own digital ecosystem. So we're not doing very well on the the EU is not doing very well on the tech sector. So I don't see that many pluses. But meanwhile, minus. I think the EU is becoming more and more assertive. It's when it can't attract countries with a carrot, it uses a whip. So it puts it punishes its own member state, be it Hungary or Slovakia. It's I think it's also the main goal of the EU was initially collective bargaining power, to have parity with the United States. So the West consists of two centers of power. But
that didn't happen, of course.
No. If you want, in a multipolar system, if you want to be one independent center of power, you have to diversify your economic ties. You have to do some trade with America, Russia, China.
But President Macron, sorry, I interrupt. President Macron these days says that Europe must do something about it.
Yeah.
If they want to succeed in that, to become some kind of power for itself.
Yeah, and Macron said this before the war as well. He said we can't be vassals of the Americans.
Yeah.
So if we only are dependent on America, which is more powerful than us, we will become vassals. So how do we become an independent pole of power? You have to diversify, not just to be too dependent. Because if you're too dependent on one country which is more powerful than you, this asymmetrical interdependence will allow them to have much more influence over you. So the EU then, as Macron also recognized, we have to have our independent policies with the Russians, independent policies with China. But what is America saying now? They're telling Europeans, cut yourself off Russia, and we blow up the Nord Stream, done. They're saying now, cut yourself off Chinese technology. Who is left? We only have America, and when we only have this one partner, our economy will be less competitive, we will be less and less relevant, and very, very dependent on the United States. So this is Macron saying what's right, but he's not doing it. Sorry, when I say we, I'm also Dutch citizen, so I sometimes fall into we.
Okay, but let's say something about Norway. Why your native country never wanted to join European Union? Even in the times when European Union was in the great times.
Well,
why?
Well, we're a small country.
But they will accept you without problems.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. We voted no twice, but much like Switzerland, it's maybe good to sit and wait, because if you're a small country, wealthy, you're not going to have much voice, but you have a lot of other powerful countries, so you're losing some of control of your own resources, perhaps. So, and also,
but that Belgium did it, and Holland, I don't know, Czech Republic, they're also small countries, and they accept.
Yeah, but the main idea, I think, was let's sit it out, see what happens, because if the EU works out well and we decide tomorrow, okay, let's join, they will always want us because we have money.
Okay,
and we don't have problems like the big, like with our neighbors and also. So it's always okay to wait, and but it's a bit of a division, because the political class, they really want to be part of EU because they want to sit at the big tables. But the people keep saying no. So the government, they keep implementing the decisions of the EU. So we're doing all the decisions. At one point they will say, listen, we're already practically members. We already did everything. Let's just join. So I think that's where they're trying to go. But I don't see a great future for the EU at the moment. So, but again, if I'm wrong, hopefully I'm wrong. The EU will be a great success. Then I hope we join later. But at the moment, I see the EU going down, and I would say let's wait and see. But so I think it's a good policy.
Professor Glen, Dizen, thank you for this interview.
My pleasure.
Poštovani гледачи, се надевам дека останавте задоволни. Повторно ќе речам, ваквите интервјуа се ретки, во нив може да слушнете и мислења кои што веројатно не се многу популарни, не се дел од она што се нарекува мејнстрим, меѓутоа повторно ќе кажам, потребно е јавноста да слуша и различни мислења, особено вакви од луѓе кои што имаат наистина високо академско звање, кои што имаат свој углед во Европа и во светот, иако нивните размислувања често пати се во спротивност со она што би им се допаднало дури на представниците на нивните земји, како со случајот со професорот Дизен. Во секој случај тоа беше се за вечерва, утре во 15 часот е репризното издание, а јас ви посакувам пријатна вечер.